Our scripture today is found in Luke 16, 10 through 12, if you'd like to follow along. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to you your trust the true riches? And ye have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? May the Lord have a blessing on these words.
Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing us together. We ask that you open our hearts and minds and show us a little bit about who you are and what you want for us today. And give us a blessing today, this morning. I too appreciated the preparation song, that the concept, take the world but give me Jesus, kind of sums up what's really important in life. In July of 1945, the world was a very different place than it is right now. My mother wasn't yet 4 years old. The economy of the United States and much of the world was on a full war footing. In the Detroit area, the Willow Run bombing factory, okay, that seems to be working, was the largest factory in the world. It had over 3.5 million square feet. The assembly line was over a mile long. It was producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of about one every hour at peak production. Women went to work in this factory because men were at war in other places, and these women and others were the inspiration for the Rosie the Riveter media icon that was used to encourage people to help in the war effort. Civilian automobile production had stopped early in the war, and the government had confiscated the remainder of the unsold automobiles and would only allow them to be sold to individuals that could demonstrate a need for an automobile. And if you wanted a new automobile, in addition to demonstrating need, your old automobile had to be over a certain number of miles and not able to be used otherwise. The remainder of the production went to military and government use. Other essential items were heavily regulated and rationed. Sugar was rationed, and the allotment of sugar was cut approximately 50% at times. Soon after Pearl Harbor, Japan seized control of the Dutch East Indies and Malaysia and cut off roughly 90% or more of the America's natural rubber supply. And what was left was quickly consumed by the U.S. war effort. It was noted that while making an aircraft carrier or a battleship required tons of steel, it also required large amounts of rubber. Not to mention all the life preservers and other uses for rubber. Civilians were only allowed to have 5 tires. And if you needed to get a tire replaced or even retreaded or recapped, you had to go to a government body and get a permission to have this done. Many of us remember in the 1970s when they had the Arab oil embargo and there was a national 55-mile-an-hour speed limit to conserve fuel. At this time, there was an even stricter speed limit. And I remember when the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit came out, and it was difficult to abide by. I wasn't driving at that time, but people didn't like it. There was a song that was popular, I can't drive 55. During the war, many places had a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, both to conserve fuel and to conserve tires, because the faster you drove, the more rapidly your tires would wear out. And both were fuel and rubber were in short supply. Employers would monitor their employees' parking lots, and they'd go out and check their tires. And if your tire was too low or not or too high, they would yell at you because you weren't helping with the war effort. Gasoline was limited. You were given a sticker for the amount of gasoline you could get. A few people, like healthcare workers, embalmers, clergy, and some other essential workers, could buy a sticker that allowed them to buy unlimited amounts of gasoline. Most people would get A stickers. They could get 4 gallons a week. Some people got B stickers. They could get 8 gallons a week. Should be noted in the 1930s, the average fuel economy was about 18 miles per gallon, so you couldn't go very far with that. These were real inconveniences, and it affected people's everyday lives. But these were inconveniences, but there was more than that. People were dying in the war. Husbands, brothers, fiancés went to war and didn't come back, or came back wounded, or psychologically damaged, or both. Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objector, was a medic in the Pacific Theater. He refused to carry a gun. He felt that it was against his beliefs. He distinguished himself by his efforts to lower wounded soldiers off the escarpment known as Hacksaw Ridge or the Madeira Escarpment. It saved many, many lives by doing that. For this feat, he would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. War is a very brutal endeavor, and at this time, our country was very, very tired of war. Victory in Europe had just been declared in May, but the war raged on in the Pacific, and many thought that the Pacific War might even be more brutal and more damaging than the war in Europe had been. And there was a strong desire to bring this war to an end. The Allied leaders met in Potsdam, and on July 20, 1945, they released a declaration laying out a demand for Japan to surrender unconditionally. In this declaration, they said it's not our intention to make Japan an enslaved race. We do intend to hold people to account, and war criminals are going to be prosecuted, but we don't want to make Japan a slave nation. We're going to take steps to make sure that Japan cannot become a military power in the future. We're going to take steps to put in a democracy type government, but we want Japan to have a pathway to go forward to be part of the community of nations in the future. And they said, we call upon the government of We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. Known only to a few at this time was the fact that the United States had developed a terrifying new weapon, and it had tested the atomic bomb for the first time in New Mexico on July 16th, only a few days before this declaration had been released. There had been a tug of war in the Japanese government between those who were committed to continuing the war and those who wanted peace, and there was much speculation about which group would prevail. So it was in this pressure cooker environment that the Japanese premier was asked about his government's reaction to the Potsdam Declaration. At this time, no formal decision had been made by his government, but he replied that he was withholding comment. He used the Japanese word mokusatsu, and I'm probably mutilating that word, but it's derived from the word for silence. This one small word would take on a big, big importance. My great-grandmother was born in Eastern Europe. She moved to this country when she was a teenager. She was able to converse in 6 languages. I don't share her linguistic skills. I can speak English most of the time, and I can say a smattering of phrases in a couple of other languages, but I'm not a linguist. But I'm told that it can be difficult to translate ideas and words from one language to another. Sometimes we think that every word in one language has an exact counterpart in another language, and it's just a matter of matching those words up and you can get an accurate translation, but that's not the case. Concepts that are common in one culture or language may not even exist in another culture or society. Cultures that live in the far north have dozens of words for different types of snow, which might be difficult for someone from a desert environment to understand. There's an unclassified national security article on this topic, agency article, NSA article, that points out it can be difficult for Bible translators to translate the Lamb of God into an Eskimo dialect when the speakers have no concept of what sheep are. Or if you're translating from a seafaring society into a culture that lives in the middle of the Sahara Desert, the concept of what an anchor is difficult to translate. So I'm told that the Japanese word mukusatsu could be appropriately translated as no comment. It could also be translated as to take no notice of, to treat with silent contempt. Some say it could be translated to remain silent in a wise and masterly inactivity. So when the premier had this news conference and replied using this word, there's debate about what he really meant. Many news organizations saw fit to tell the world that in the eyes of the Japanese government, the ultimatum was unworthy of comment. These reports understandably angered U.S. officials who saw it as an expression of the militaristic group in the Japanese government being supreme. And lacking what they felt was a suitable response to this declaration, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki a few days later on August 9th. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of Japan on August 15th, and that was followed by the formal signing of the surrender declaration on September 2nd, 1945. The translation of one small word had dramatic consequences for the outcome of the war and for the citizens of Japan. Now, to be fair, there are scholars who argue that the word was not mistranslated, and some argue that they were intentionally trying to respond with an ambiguous response while not accepting the declaration, and that may be the case. But the translation certainly didn't help. Small things can have big consequences. Pay attention to the small details. In the 1980s, the rock band Van Halen became notorious for having a clause in their concert writer contracts that said they were to be provided numerous different things. And one thing they said is, we want a bowl of M&Ms with no brown M&Ms in the bowl. And this was used as an example of obnoxious and entitled rock musicians throwing their weight around to get what they wanted. And that may be the case. But it was also explained later that there was a practical benefit to this clause. This group, when they traveled, typically would travel with 9 18-wheeler trailers or trucks full of gear for their show. They were often performing in venues that were smaller and might have difficulty accommodating the electrical needs and the support needs of the show that was being put on. And if the electrical connections and support that were specified in the contract weren't properly adhered to, then it could be dangerous for the concert attendees or for the performers or others. And they explained that if they got to the concert hall and they went into their dressing room and their dining area and there was a bowl of M&Ms and there were still brown M&Ms there, they knew that somebody didn't read or pay attention to their contract, and there were probably other problems as well. Small things can be important. Sometimes we think something is small, but it's actually a big deal. There is a temple in India, a Hindu temple, that is dedicated to one of the Hindu gods. It's believed to have been built during the 15th century. There is a legend concerning this temple that, and every year they serve a sweet pudding made of rice and milk. In fact, they serve it, I believe, daily. And it is believed that their deity comes and visits the temple to accept that offering. But according to this legend, years ago, their deity appeared in the form of a sage in the court of the king who ruled the region, and he challenged him to a game of chess. And the prize was decided before the game was played, and the king asked the sage what he would like for his prize. And he said, "I'm a modest man. I'd like 1 grain of rice to be placed on the first square of the checkerboard, 2 on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the next, and doubling and so on until all 64 squares on the chessboard are covered with rice, doubling each time." And the king said, "I can do that. I have plenty of rice." And the game was played. The king lost the game, and the sage asked for his reward. The king started to count out the grains of rice, and pretty soon he realized that he had woefully underestimated what he had agreed to. And if you do the mathematical calculations, if you double a grain of rice 64 times, you will end up with thousands of times more rice than the whole world produces in a single year. It was impossible for the king to honor the reward that he had promised. And the legend says that the deity then came back and said, "I'll forgive you, and you can pay this off over time." And therefore, they served this rice pudding as a payment in part for the debt. The point I'm making is sometimes things that appear to be very small are actually very, very important. The apparently trivial request of the sage was a request that even a king could not pay for. The Bible is full of stories that draw attention to little things as being most important. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells the parable of the 10 virgins. And if we start in verse 5, I'm going to read a little bit of this. "Then the kingdom of heaven is likened unto 10 virgins who took their lamps and went forth to meet the bridegroom. And 5 of them were wise, and 5 were foolish. They were foolish, took their lamps, but took no oil with them. But the wise took all the oil in their vessels with their lamps. While the bridegroom tarried, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight there was a cry made, Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out and meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said unto the wise, Give us of your oil, for our lamps are gone out. But the wise answered and said, No, not so, lest there not be enough for you and us, but go rather to them that sell, and buy for yourselves. And while they went out to buy, the bridegroom came, and they that were ready went in with him to meet the marriage. And the door was shut. Afterward came also the other virgins, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered and said, Verily I say unto you, I know ye not. Watch therefore, for ye know not neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. For the want of a little bit of oil, they lost the ability to attend the ceremony. They were shut out. I've titled this sermon, Small Actions Can Have Large Consequences, but God, just as Jesus says, small things are really, really, really big. So what are some of the small things that are part of our lives that can have really big consequences? Most of us want to have healthy, happy, fulfilling lives. My grandmother graduated from Adelphian Academy in 1938. In that year, scientists began a study known as the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It initially tracked 268 sophomore students of Harvard College, as it was known at that time, as well as control groups from disadvantaged inner-city Boston neighborhoods. They followed these individuals. They were initially all men, although later women and others were included, over decades. They were interviewed periodically, both by questionnaire and in person. Their family members were interviewed. They were observed in their homes. They were recorded and videotaped. They had lengthy psychological evaluations. They had extensive physical exams. They recorded what was served in their homes for food. They looked at disciplinary styles in the home. Their medical records were reviewed. Later in the study, as technology changed, Other studies were done. They drew blood and did genetic and DNA analysis. They looked at things like cholesterol levels and blood sugar levels, rates of diabetes and heart disease. They did functional MRI studies. The functional MRI is where you give someone a radioactive tracer and you can do an MRI and look at someone's brain while they're doing an activity. And using a radioactive detector, you can see changes where the brain is more active. So they would do functional MRIs while they would put people under stress. Sometimes they would go to someone and say, okay, as part of our study, we're going to have you give a speech to 4 judges in 5 minutes. That puts a lot of people under stress. They said, we're going to judge you on how good your speech is. And the judges are going to be, watching you remotely, so you won't see them there. And then, as they're getting ready, they'll also say, I'm going to give you a very easy task to measure your response to stress. We're going to have you take the number 2,000 and subtract 17 from it and do that over and over again. That's kind of a difficult thing to do in your head. But if they made a mistake, they would tell you, wait a minute, this is a very easy thing and you're making mistakes. And that tended to make them stressed more. So they looked at their responses to stress. These individuals are followed for decades. Some of them went from absolute poverty, and remember, there was a control group from disadvantaged inner city neighborhoods, to the very top of society in terms of income and prestige. One individual in the study became President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. Others fell from a high position in life to a very low position. Some became alcoholics. Most of these men served in World War II. This study is one of the longest studies of adult health in the world. The researchers collected volumes of data over decades and decades of time. When scientists do a study and collect data like this, they like to look at their data and say, how can we use this data to predict what people are going to do in the future? So they said, if we look at everything we know about these men, how can we predict what's going to happen to them later in life? And this study was no exception. They wondered what would predict a person's physical and emotional health in the future, and would it be the age at which their parents died, the level of cholesterol in their blood, the amount of time they spent exercising, what habits they developed. One of the most important factors that they found, which appeared to be a little factor, was the number of close, important personal relationships that these individuals had. People with more and warmer connections developed diseases of aging, such as coronary artery disease and diabetes, at a later age or at lower percentages than those that had more connections. Those that were happiest in their relationships at age 50 were more likely to be healthy and happy at age 80. They used a number of ways to define close personal relationships. They didn't have to be romantic partners, although they could be. And there was no set number of relationships that was needed. And they pointed out that different people have different needs for personal interactions. I'm somewhat of an introvert. So I have very close, important relationships with people that I value deeply, but I might spend less time with my relationship with people than somebody who's an extrovert. And I have family members who just thrive on talking to people and get energy from going and meeting people. And I'm not one of those people. I like spending time with people, but I'm wired a little different. But they looked at is, did people feel that they had appropriate levels of connection with other people? Another way they asked this question was, do you have someone you can call in the middle of the night if you have an emergency, or if you're scared, or if you're unwell? And unfortunately, there were many people who responded that they had no one they could call in such a situation. People without connections are more vulnerable emotionally, mentally, and physically. Loneliness kills people. The healthcare insurer Cigna did a study, and they found there's an epidemic of loneliness and isolations in this world. In the United States, 43% of adults felt that they lacked companionship. 43% felt that their relationships were not meaningful and were isolated from others, and 39% no longer felt close to anyone. Loneliness can lead to results in measurable changes that occur physiologically. And there's different reasons for that. God made us to be hardwired to be around people. And if you are around people, you have advantages for survival and for well-being. If you were a hunter-gatherer society and you were trying to hunt, or you were at a dangerous place, you were much better off if you were in a group of people. And if you were alone, it was much harder for you to survive. We have found that if somebody has somebody else in their home when they sleep, and I'm not talking about a burglar, but someone that's supposed to be there that's presumably supportive, whether that's a partner they sleep with or just someone even in the next room, people that have somebody in their home when they sleep longer and more deeply than people that don't. You can measure changes that are physiological when people are with other people. The response to stress is different in people that have connections with others. If you are stressed, your cortisol level goes up, you get a fight or flight response, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, and you get prepared to deal with a emergency. People that have connections with people tend to relax after the emergency is done, and their heart rate and their physiological changes tend to go back to normal. People who lack those connections don't do that to the same extent, and so you have metabolic changes that occur. You have higher levels of inflammation. You have higher rates of diabetes and other issues that way. As Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that our bodies are the temple of God. We spend a lot of time encouraging each other to practice healthy habits in the area of diet, avoiding smoking, not drinking. And it's been noted that the effects of loneliness and isolation are comparable to the risks of smoking or other behaviors that we clearly want to avoid. We should spend at least as much time attempting to build healthy relationships as we do looking at other physical, well-beings. The Christianity is dying in Western civilizations, unfortunately. Europe is, by and large, a secular society right now, and North America is headed in that direction. And we still have pockets of Christianity and places where people come and support each other and come together, but that is decreasing. And one of the reasons is because we have not done a very good job of showing people what true Christianity is like. The Bible is full of examples showing how Christians are to behave and how Christians are to lift one another up. Romans 12:10 says, "Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor." Go on to verse 13. "Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality." Hebrews 10:24. "Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and unto good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much more so as you see the day approaching." We need to remember that one of the primary important functions of the gospel is to bring us together and to rub off our rough edges and to allow us to support each other. So the question is how do we develop relationships? And, it's been interesting. In the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there's been some research that's been done. And most churches, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church, will baptize a fair number of people. And unfortunately, if you go and track those people and come back a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later, there's a tremendous number that will fall away and no longer remain a part of the group. And one of the best predictors for somebody that will remain a part of the church is somebody who makes multiple connections with multiple individuals over time. There has been some research looking at ways in which we can facilitate connections with each other. Most Most connections and friendships develop through repeated casual connections. They actually did a study, this is kind of interesting, where they looked at, they assigned people to go ride the subway. And after they rode the subway, they did a questionnaire that had been validated to look at their happiness and well-being. And the experimental group, they asked to specifically go out of their way to talk to somebody that was a stranger to them and interact with them. And that might just be saying, it's hot out, or, traffic is really bad today. But they just had random interactions and were instructed to specifically go out and do that. The control group was allowed to be on their phone and just do their usual activity. And interestingly enough, the ones that were interacting with other individuals reported higher levels of well-being and happiness than the ones that did not do that, even though these were very brief, fleeting interactions. God wants us to connect with each other. Volunteering can be a powerful way to make connections with each other and to be helpful. There was actually a longitudinal study that looked at over 66,000 people. This one was in the UK. Yeah, my notes got out of line here. And they found that those that volunteered, and they stratified the volunteer activity in that they never did it. They did it occasionally, maybe once a month or so, or frequently, and then once a week or more than that or whatever. And they found that especially in individuals over age 40, frequent volunteer activity resulted in higher levels of mental well-being and satisfaction. And people who volunteer connect with people and work with people that are also concerned about similar things. Our families are important. And again, many times we might think, well, families are a minor thing, and the important things in life are, how much we make or what our house is like or whatever. But our families are one of the most important things, whether that's our biological families or our church families. And finding ways to strengthen those connections is an important part of the Christian experience. I'm going to read a section here from 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And I'm going to cut some of this out, so give me a second. But you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so that this day should not surprise you like a thief. You are all children of the light and children of the day. We do not belong to the night or to the darkness, so then let us be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let's be sober. For God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. He died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. And then this is the point I wanted to make. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as you are doing. God wants us to come together, to interact with each other, to share each other's burdens, and to make everybody's life a better place. And what research shows is that even small interactions and small connections can have a huge impact. In Matthew 25, after Jesus tells parables, including the one of the virgins, Jesus says, "Then when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels are with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate the people one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left, and the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him and say, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whoever did this for one of the least of these my brothers and sisters, you did it for me.'" Small actions can have huge, lifelong, eternal consequences. I pray that God will help us to concentrate on the important small things that are really big things.